What's going on, you guys? My name's Ty Knotts, and welcome to Top 5 Unknowns, 5 mysterious cases from 2019. Number 5. Beginning in summer of 2018, during peak vacation time, this strange and tragic mystery began. Tourists visiting the Dominican Republic began to die under unknown circumstances. What started as a single perplexing case has now grown to the unsolved deaths of over 9 tourists. The first victims were Nathaniel Edward Holmes and Cynthia Ann Day, aged 63 and 49 respectively. The couple had traveled to the Dominican Republic and booked a luxurious stay at a resort. What they got, however, was less than relaxing. The two was found in their hotel bed on May 30th, 2018. After being discovered in their La Ramona resort room, they were immediately taken to a coroner to determine the cause. The autopsy found that the couple suffered respiratory failure and fluid was found in their lungs. Cynthia suffered from a cerebral edema, which is accumulating fluid around the brain, creating fatal pressure. 1 year later, the cause of these ailments has yet to be identified. A month later, Yvette Monique Sport was vacationing with her fiancé in the Dominican Republic. The 51-year-old Pennsylvania woman reportedly had a drink at the minibar, took a shower, and passed away in her sleep. She was found unresponsive by her fiancé the next morning. The cause was initially ruled as a heart attack, but new evidence proved that unlikely, and her remains are still being investigated. 7 similar cases followed. In many investigations, the victims suffered the same causes as the first 2, respiratory failure or fluid buildup. In some cases, however, this was described as the result of a heart attack, and in others, no cause has been given. Where there are some similarities among victims, such as similar causes, having a drink from the minibar before bed, and the condition in which they were discovered, usually in the morning hours, there's not enough exact circumstances to connect these events and pinpoint a cause. In fact, every death has occurred at a different resort, making foul play almost impossible to conclude. Investigators have kept many of these cases open and urge tourists to avoid resorts in that region until they find an answer. Number 4. When the remains of former paratrooper Everett Palmer arrived at the funeral home, the funeral director reported serious damage to Mr. Palmer's head and clear bruises circled around his neck. Palmer's family immediately sought answers, but they've yet to be delivered. The only very small piece of information that his family found at the time was that 48 hours before his death, he was transported to York County Prison, where he was placed in solitary confinement and eventually died. The first coroner's report claimed that the cause was undetermined. An autopsy performed by a coroner hired by the Palmer family declared that foul play was certainly involved, but that not much else was easily determined. This case first gained popularity when the Palmer family claimed that Everett's organs were missing. His throat, heart, and brain were not included when his body was transferred, and they believed those pieces held important clues about the circumstances of his passing. Of course, the public was in outrage as they were baffled at the concept of a young man's organs being hidden from the investigation. It was later revealed that the organs were being detained at the county office. While this clears up the whereabouts of these vital pieces, it still brings up the concern that the county would keep key evidence away from the family, who were still suspecting guards or employees working at the prison at the time as being responsible for his death. To further this possibility, another independent forensic investigator was hired by the Palmer family and determined that Everett's cause was homicide, with physical restraint under police custody. Another confusing aspect of this case is that trace amounts of methamphetamine were found in the young man's system. His family argued that he could not have attained this drug on his own, as he was confined to a small cell, completely alone and stripped of any personal belongings. Palmer's arrest occurred while he was on a trip to see his mother when he stopped in Lancaster to resolve an outstanding warrant. He hoped to simply make arrangements for the charge and carry on, paying the due balance at a later date. Instead, he was arrested on site and charged a $5,000 bond. He was transferred to York County Prison later on, and while there, officers reported that Palmer was agitated and claimed that he was suicidal. As a result, he was placed in a solitary cell where he eventually began to bang his head against the cell door, causing physical harm to himself. At that point, another officer came into Palmer's cell, where it was described as a 23-minute scuffle. During this conflict, Palmer was tased, restrained, and given a hood to put over his head to avoid him biting another officer. While there's video footage of these alleged events, the county refuses to release them, claiming that they don't paint a clear picture of what happened. As for now, the Palmer case is still ongoing, with more and more confusing evidence coming to light with each passing day. Number 3. In January of 2019, a house fire raged in southeast DC. Officers were driving through a suburban neighborhood on their way to an unrelated call when they noticed the home up in flames. Quickly, firefighters arrived at the scene and extinguished the flames, which had engulfed the home almost entirely. After the scene was clear and officers were allowed to investigate, they found 2 bodies. 60-year-old Michael Burgess and 50-year-old Regina Bowman were found in the living room of the home. Regina Bowman was a longtime member of the civilian police force in DC and had just recently retired in 2016. This information was confirmed in a public statement by the DC police chief. As for the cause at first, investigators naturally assumed that their untimely deaths were the result of the fatal fire and that no foul play was involved. However, that assumption was quickly deconstructed as the coroner performed their investigation to unveil a more disturbing case was at hand. Upon inspecting the slightly burnt remains, the coroner found signs of a struggle. Additionally, it was determined that Burgess and Bowman were strangled, restrained, and showed signs of serious blunt force trauma to their heads. Obviously, it was then determined that the fire was not the cause in this situation, and instead it was concluded that the fire was the means to destroy evidence or cover the crime. If police had not just so happened to show up en route to another location, it's likely that the fire would have effectively done just that. So it's very lucky for investigation's sake that the officers arrived. But nevertheless, there are still questions that need to be answered and evidence that needs to be unveiled concerning this case. In February, officers made a statement that they've been working non-stop on the investigation, and they've come across a few witnesses or friends and family of the couple that allegedly provide them with good information concerning the case, although it's yet to be said exactly what that information was. Now, about 6 months after the discovery, the case remains unsolved and under investigation. Number 2. Although this case comes from 2011, it's still considered open and ongoing, with more questions arising each day. Air Force Technical Sergeant Curtis Eccleston was found deceased in his apartment in Japan in February. He was brutally stabbed and left on the floor in his home. NCIS immediately reported to the scene to begin their investigation. One investigator claimed it was the worst crime scene she'd come across in her entire career. At first, concerns were brought up over the whereabouts of Eccleston's wife, who was nowhere to be found. They worried she may have been kidnapped or dropped somewhere by the killer. However, as more information would come to light about her, she was found safe several hours later. She was allegedly entirely unaware of what had happened to her husband. Additionally, it was discovered that the couple had a rocky marriage and that Barbara had been having an affair. At the time of his death, Barbara and Eccleston were beginning the process of a divorce. These key indicators made Barbara an instant suspect. During the first investigation with Barbara, she behaved oddly. Her first comment to police was a completely unsolicited "I was not home last night." She did not seem distraught, concerned, or even a little bit confused. One investigator commented that although she was going through a divorce, there are certain questions you'd expect from a grieving widow that simply weren't there. Barbara began to point fingers, explaining that she frequently found money and drugs all over the place while cleaning their apartment. While her claims made sense, the way she delivered them was jumbled, all over the place and sometimes irrelevant. Investigators continued searching for answers and found that not only did Eccleston not have any enemies, he was actually very loved and admired by friends, family, and colleagues. Eventually, NCIS considered the possibility that there could have been a drug dealer that was involved that night, and perhaps the drug deal went wrong. However, when considered at this angle, it just doesn't match up. Officers found no leads and every possibility from the drug angle ran cold. Additionally, the murder and its deliberate attempt at a cover-up was too diabolical to be a deal gone wrong. As evidence became apparent, it was found that some wounds to Eccleston were actually performed after his death. Additionally, other things suggested that he could have been killed elsewhere and then brought back to his apartment. Eventually, Barbara's wife was brought in as a genuine suspect in his death, but this didn't really lead much of anywhere. Many investigators that worked on the case continue to search for the truth, describing just how hard something like this actually is to endure as a professional. Number 1. This is less about one specific case and more about a strange phenomenon that's been ongoing in the US. A non-profit program known as Black and Missing Foundation compiled FBI statistics to find that in 2016, over 200,000 people of color went missing. Of that, about 37% were young black women under the age of 18. It's estimated that this year, over 75,000 black women and girls are gonna go missing, many of which vanished earlier this year during an unsettling spike in cases. A majority percentage of these cases occurred in January to April of 2019, with black women and girls primarily going missing in the DC area. In most of these cases, there's little to no evidence to lead investigators on a substantial discovery. Additionally, many civil rights and social justice groups have come together to claim that there's a lack of forensic investigation and media coverage about these cases. In fact, when asking the average person, they'd have no idea just how many black women are currently missing. Furthermore, independent researchers have reported that not only is there a lack of media coverage, but that most media coverage ends up being completely removed from the internet. At this time, there are only a few articles outlining this crisis and certain victims of it. Many have reported reading articles through specific news outlets before, but are unable to find them again. One YouTube commenter described that she saw the story on her local news one night, and when she called in for information on the next day, the producers claimed that the story was never covered and likely didn't exist. Many conspiracy theorists suspect that this is a satanic worshipping cult of the elite. Others connect it to the growing issues of sexual trafficking. Some credit the government and describe the ordeal as a mass attempt to remove black members from the community. But regardless of what your theory is, the issue needs to be significantly more covered and investigated. Voices must be heard or the lives can be saved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep updated with our videos.